The luxurious ballroom fell silent as a glass of red wine was thrown straight into the face of the young pregnant woman. In that instant, the sound of breaking glass and shocked gasps froze the air. No one expected that the elegant silver-haired woman, the mother-in-law, would humiliate her like this in front of everyone. What they didn't know was that the woman covered in wine was the secret heir to the entire empire, about to close an $800 million deal that her mother-in-law had been chasing all her life. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story? Under the pale Texas morning, the glass facade of the Caldwell auction house shimmered like a polished mirror, reflecting a world that Andrew Caldwell no longer recognized. Inside, marble floors echoed the hurried steps of assistants preparing for another sale, another display of wealth that meant nothing to him anymore. He walked through the lobby, nodding briefly to employees who lowered their eyes the moment his gaze swept over them. For years, Andrew had built an empire from precision and control, never tolerating hesitation, never forgiving mistakes. Success had brought him everything: money, respect, power, but had quietly taken something larger: his family. He stood before the massive portrait of his late wife, its golden frame glowing beneath the morning light. The painter had caught her eyes perfectly calm and knowing. Every morning he stopped here, pretending to adjust his tie, pretending it wasn't guilt that froze him in place. Outside, the sound of traffic mixed with the hum of the city, steady and indifferent. He checked his watch. 9 sharp. Meetings, contracts, signatures, everything predictable. Until a secretary rushed in with trembling hands, clutching an envelope marked urgent. Andrew frowned, the muscles of his jaw tightening. The letter bore a name he hadn't heard in over a decade: Elena Sterling. Once they had shared business, friendship, and betrayal, all in one breath. Now her signature appeared beside a simple request: "Please attend the gala tonight. It concerns a matter you left unfinished." He read the line twice, as if the paper could explain itself. It couldn't. The ink looked deliberate, almost defiant. For the first time in years, Andrew felt the steady rhythm of his day slip. The letter trembled slightly between his fingers, betraying what he would never admit: that part of him feared whatever waited behind those words. He folded the note carefully, sliding it into his jacket pocket like something fragile. Outside, clouds gathered above Austin's skyline, promising rain that hadn't yet begun. He turned to the window, watching the reflection of his own face fade into the glass. Time had drawn lines where certainty used to live. "Reschedule the morning," he said quietly to his assistant. "All of it." She blinked, surprised. Andrew Caldwell never canceled anything. Yet his tone left no space for questions. As she hurried away, he reached for his coffee, but the warmth had gone. The taste of bitterness lingered anyway. The afternoon brought a strange silence to the office, the kind that crept in when people sensed something unusual. Andrew sat alone in the conference room, the same space where he had once celebrated million-dollar deals with champagne and applause. Now, even the hum of the air conditioner felt too loud. His gaze drifted to the letter again. "A matter you left unfinished." What could she possibly mean? He hadn't spoken to Elena since the night everything collapsed: the partnership, the trust, and in ways he hated to admit, his own capacity for grace. The door clicked softly. Lydia, his senior assistant of 15 years, entered, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. She'd been with him long enough to notice when the rhythm changed. "You're going to that gala, aren't you?" she asked, placing the cup beside him. He didn't answer. "It's been a long time since anyone's seen you at those things." He smiled faintly, more out of habit than humor. "Some debts don't stay buried, Lydia." Her eyes softened. "And some don't deserve to be paid again." But Andrew only looked out the window. His reflection caught between streaks of rain now sliding down the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost thoughtful. "Tell the driver to be ready by 7. That evening, the storm rolled in early. By the time he left the building, the sky was a sheet of dark velvet split with silver veins of lightning. His black sedan waited at the curb, engine running a refuge against the cold drizzle. Inside, the driver glanced at him through the mirror. Downtown, Sir Andrew nodded. The city lights blurred through the rain as they drove, turning Austin's familiar skyline into a watercolor of gold and gray. He loosened his tie, something he rarely did, and rested his head against the seat. A whisper of jazz came from the radio, an old Miles Davis track he hadn't heard in years. It reminded him of his wife's laughter of Sunday mornings when success hadn't yet cost so much. The memory stung, but he didn't turn it off. When they reached the Sterling Plaza, the world outside glowed with chandeliers and camera flashes. The gala was in full swing. Men in tailored suits and women in evening gowns floated through the entrance like a river of color and perfume. For a brief second, Andrew considered turning back. He could still tell the driver to vanish back into his fortress of glass and silence, but the thought of unfinished business pulled stronger than pride. He stepped out the rain, brushing his shoulders like a reminder that no armor lasts forever. Inside, the warmth hit him first, followed by the low murmur of expensive conversation. Waiters passed with silver trays offering champagne he didn't take. Every glance that found him was polite, measured, curious. He had built his reputation on control. Tonight it felt like a mask cracking under the light. Then he saw her, Elena, across the ballroom, speaking to a cluster of investors beneath a grand chandelier. Her hair was silver now, elegant rather than old, and her posture carried the same quiet strength he remembered. She turned, and for one heartbeat their eyes met. Time didn't rewind, but something in the air shifted. A flicker of recognition, and beneath it, something else, unfinished truth. Andrew exhaled slowly, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. The orchestra struck a soft chord, and somewhere in the background, a reporter's flash lit up the room. The night had begun, and whatever waited beneath its glittering surface was already in motion. The rain had not stopped by the time Andrew arrived at the Driscoll Hotel, that grand relic of Austin's gilded past. The valet opened his door beneath a golden awning where droplets slid like silver threads over brass lamps. Inside, the lobby glowed with the warmth of old Texas charm-polished wood velvet armchairs, portraits of cowboys who looked too proud to ever apologize for anything. It was the kind of place where power and nostalgia danced in the same tune. Andrew paused for a moment under the archway, taking in the faint scent of tobacco and leather that clung to the air. Every corner whispered of history of deals made in whispers of secrets wrapped in bourbon. He straightened his jacket and entered the ballroom where the gala was already in motion. Music floated through the air. A slow waltz played by a live quartet, and the murmur of conversation spread like ripples on a lake. At the far end of the room stood Elena Sterling, her poise magnetic, her silver hair shining beneath the chandeliers. She spoke to reporters with the ease of someone used to being watched. Andrew recognized that posture. It belonged to survivors. Their eyes met again, brief but charged. She gave him a polite nod, the kind that hides 100 unspoken memories. He crossed the room, every step measured until they stood an arm's length apart. "Elena," he said softly, "you look exactly the same." "And you?" she replied, her smile faint, but knowing still arrive when the storm does. The remark carried both irony and invitation. A waiter appeared, offering champagne. She took one glass. He refused. The bubbles shimmered like tiny clocks counting down to something neither could avoid. "You read my letter?" She continued, her tone smooth yet edged with purpose. "I did," he answered. "You said there was a matter unfinished." She gestured toward the stage where a screen displayed images of the Sterling Foundation's upcoming project, a restoration of historic homes in East Austin. "We're expanding," she explained, "and we've discovered something in one of the properties, something with your name on it." His brow furrowed. "My name, a ledger, from 20 years ago, with your handwriting and my father's signature." The music swelled as if the orchestra itself had sensed the tension. Andrew's pulse quickened. He had buried that part of his life deep beneath contracts and polite denials. Elena's voice softened. "I didn't bring you here for revenge. I brought you because what's inside that ledger could either destroy or redeem everything you've built." For the first time in years, Andrew felt the ground shift beneath his calm exterior. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, echoing through the old bones of the hotel like an omen waiting to be fulfilled. The ballroom lights dimmed as a hush spread through the crowd. A spotlight fell upon the stage where Elena stood poised with the elegance of someone long accustomed to commanding a room. Behind her, the screen flickered to life again, this time showing a photograph, a younger Andrew Caldwell shaking hands with her father outside an old brick warehouse. The audience murmured softly, unaware of the storm that photo had just reignited between them. Andrew's breath caught. Memories returned with surgical precision, the smell of dust and varnish, the ink stains on his hands, the night he signed that deal, knowing the numbers didn't tell the whole truth. Elena's voice broke through the hum. 2 decades ago, this building became the cornerstone of what would later turn into Caldwell Holdings. My father believed in its potential, but somewhere along the way, belief turned into betrayal. Her words were gentle but pierced cleanly. Andrew's jaw tightened. He stepped closer to the stage, his polished shoes silent against the marble. "Elena not here," he said quietly. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "Then, where Andrew?" The truth has waited long enough. The audience thought they were watching business rivals spar. Only a few sensed the history vibrating beneath each syllable. He turned away, but her voice followed. "It's not about the money. It's about what you took and what you left behind." He froze mid-step. The line hit harder than any accusation. For a moment, the gala's glitter dissolved, leaving only 2 people standing in the wreckage of old choices. Elena left the stage and approached him, the crowd's chatter swelling like background noise. "The ledger will be delivered to your office tomorrow morning," she said softly. "I want you to see what you signed that night and what my father tried to protect." Andrew met her gaze, searching for anger and finding only fatigue. "You think I don't remember," he murmured. "You remember the prophet," she replied, "not the promise." The orchestra began another song, its melody tender and slow, cruelly out of place. She turned and walked away, her silhouette framed by chandeliers that suddenly seemed too bright. Andrew stood alone amid the applause that followed her speech, the noise crashing against the hollow space inside him. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air, stirring a memory he had spent years trying to bury the night her father died, and the letter Andrew never answered. A waiter approached timidly, offering another glass of champagne. Andrew took it this time not to celebrate, but to steady the tremor in his hand. The taste burned sharp and familiar. He looked up to find Elena speaking quietly with a young woman near the exit, perhaps an assistant. The resemblance struck him, then the same eyes, the same calm defiance. His mind began to piece together what his conscience had long ignored. As she disappeared through the doorway, he exhaled the sound lost in the music. The storm outside roared again, shaking the hotel windows. Andrew placed the empty glass on a nearby table and whispered to no one in particular. "Maybe this is what unfinished looks like." The morning after the gala broke gray and restless over the city. Austin's skyline shimmered with a thin veil of mist that clung to the rooftops like unspoken secrets. Andrew sat at his office desk long before dawn, the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft whir of the espresso machine, his only company. His suit jacket hung neatly over the chair, but his tie was gone, as if he had finally stopped pretending that control could hold the day together. On his desk lay a brown envelope, no sender, no markings, except his name written in a neat, deliberate hand. He didn't need to open it to know what it contained. Still, he slit the edge with a silver letter opener, the same one his wife had given him on their 10th anniversary. Inside was a thin ledger yellowed with age, its spine cracked but intact. The moment he touched it, a memory surfaced, the sound of Elena's father's voice, steady and kind, saying, "We don't build fortunes, Andrew. We build trust." He flipped through the pages slowly. There were his initials, his handwriting, his signature on a line that shouldn't have existed, and beneath it a note scrawled in a different hand dated the night before the deal closed. "He knows. Tell her the truth before I do." Andrew's fingers trembled. He hadn't seen that message before. Someone must have added it after he'd walked away that night. He sank back in his chair, the sound of the rain against the window echoing like a slow confession. All those years he'd told himself the deal was clean, that her father had agreed willingly. But now he knew the man had tried to stop him. He had chosen silence over honesty, and that silence had cost a life. A soft knock came at the door. Lydia entered quietly, carrying his schedule for the day. "You've got the foundation call at 10, she began, then saw the open ledger. Her voice softened. "Is that it? The thing from the gala?" He nodded without looking up. "It's worse than I thought." Lydia hesitated, then said, "You've built a lot of good since then, Andrew. Maybe it's time to stop running from the rest." He smiled faintly, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "You sound like my wife." "She was the one who saw the best in you," Lydia replied gently. "Maybe it's still there." He closed the ledger, tied it back inside the envelope, and stood. "Send word to the Sterling Foundation," he said. "Tell them I'd like to meet Elena again, this time off the record." Lydia paused. "You're not thinking of confessing, are you?" "No," he said. I'm thinking of starting over." As she left, he turned to the window. Outside, the sun was breaking through the clouds, faint and uncertain, but there all the same. He thought of the ledger of promises made and forgotten, of names written beside his own. Somewhere in the city, Elena was likely doing the same reading, remembering, wondering whether redemption could arrive 20 years too late. The air inside the Caldwell penthouse that evening felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of old secrets. Andrew poured himself a drink he didn't really want, just to have something in his hands while his mind spun in quiet circles. The city outside flickered through the rain, neon signs trembling in puddles along the street below. He turned the ledger over on his desk again and again, as though repetition could change what it said. At 8, his phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. at the old Sterling warehouse. Come alone." There was no signature, but he knew who had sent it. He stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone down beside the glass. The whiskey had gone flat, the ice melted. He wandered toward the window and pressed his palm against the cool glass. The reflection that looked back at him was older than he remembered, lines etched deep around the eyes, the posture of a man who had carried success like armor and found it rusting. Somewhere below, a siren wailed and faded into the night. He thought of Elena's face at the gala, calm, but wounded, of her father's name beside his on the ledger. The past wasn't a ghost anymore. It had a voice, and it was calling him to listen. He turned back toward his desk and opened the bottom drawer. Beneath old files and unused stationery lay a photograph, his late wife and their son, Ethan, at a lakeside cabin years ago. Ethan's laughter still lived somewhere in the corners of that memory, unspoiled by the distance between them. He hadn't spoken to his son in 3 years, not since the argument that had ended with the words, "You care more about your legacy than your family." Andrew exhaled, long and unsteady. Maybe Elena wasn't the only one waiting for him to make things right. He picked up the phone again and scrolled through the contacts until he found Ethan's number. His thumb hovered over the screen but didn't press call. "Not yet," he whispered. "Let me fix this first." The rain intensified, tapping against the glass like an impatient clock. He returned to the desk, sealed the ledger inside its envelope, and slid it into his briefcase. Tomorrow he would face the warehouse again, the place where everything had begun. Maybe Elena would be there waiting, or maybe she would simply leave the door unlocked and let him see what forgiveness looked like in silence. He switched off the lamp and stood in the dim glow of the city lights. The apartment felt cavernous, filled with echoes of conversations that had never happened. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful or untouchable. He just felt human. Before turning in, he murmured to the darkness, "You said we build trust, not fortunes. I hope it's not too late to learn that." Outside, thunder rolled again, as if the sky itself answered. The next morning broke clear and cold, the kind of brightness that made the world look honest for a few short hours before shadows crept back in. Andrew drove east, leaving downtown Austin's polished skyline behind for the worn industrial stretch where the city kept its older memories. The warehouse waited at the end of a narrow road, half swallowed by ivy and silence. It looked smaller than he remembered, yet heavier with the weight of everything left unsaid. He parked beside a faded pickup and stepped out. The gravel crunched under his shoes. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked, then quieted as if the whole street had agreed to hold its breath. The heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar, the rusted lock broken. He pushed one side open, and the scent of dust oil and old timber rolled over him, time itself, unhurried and unforgiving. Light slanted through cracked windows, catching particles in midair. The space was empty except for a few scattered crates and an old drafting table. On it lay another envelope smaller than the one from yesterday. His name again, written in the same neat script. He didn't touch it immediately. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the room, tracing the outlines of memories he had tried to bury, the laughter of work crews, the hum of machinery, the last conversation with her father. "You're better than this, Andrew," the man had said. And he hadn't been. When he finally opened the envelope, a single photograph slipped out. It showed 3 people himself. Elena and her father standing outside this very building on the day the contract was signed. But someone had drawn a thin red circle around the date in the corner. Beneath it, a short note in Elena's handwriting, "You weren't the only one who kept something." He turned the photo over. On the back, another message. He left something here for you. Andrew looked up sharply. The warehouse was quiet except for the faint rattle of wind against the windows. He scanned the walls, then his eyes landed on a section of old shelving along the far end, one panel darker than the rest. He crossed the floor, running his hand over the wood until it gave way with a soft creak, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a metal box, small and covered in dust. His breath slowed. The key was already in his pocket, the one he'd kept all these years without remembering why. He slid it into the lock, and it turned easily. The lid opened with a sigh. Inside were papers, a watch, and a folded letter addressed in the late Mr. Sterling's hand. Andrew stared at it for a long time before unfolding it, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. If you are reading this, Andrew, it means I never found the courage to speak my last truth. We make choices believing they protect the people we love. But lies, even quiet ones, have a way of finding daylight. You have the power to make this right, not for me, but for her. The handwriting stopped mid-line as if interrupted. Andrew lowered the letter, his throat tightening. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked. He turned toward the sound. Andrew froze at the sound, a faint scuff of movement beyond the columns of the old structure. His pulse slowed into a steady rhythm, the kind that came before confrontation. "Elena?" He called out, his voice echoing across the high ceiling. Silence answered, but then came the soft click of heels approaching through the dust. She stepped out from the shadowed corner, dressed in a navy coat, her expression unreadable. "You found it," she said quietly. "He left that letter for you. I wasn't sure you'd have the courage to come." Andrew held the paper between his fingers, the edges trembling slightly. "Why bring me here?" he asked. "Because this is where the truth started," she replied, "and it's where it should end." She walked closer, her eyes resting on the open metal box. "Do you know what that watch is?" He looked down. "He wore it every day. He wanted you to have it," she said. "He told me once that forgiveness is only possible when both sides remember they were human." Andrew exhaled the words, cutting deeper than she intended. "He was a better man than me." "He was just a man," she corrected softly. "He believed people could change." She turned her gaze toward the high windows where morning light poured in thin golden ribbons. "When he died, I thought I hated you. But I think what I really hated was how much he still trusted you even at the end." He folded the letter and set it carefully back into the box. "I didn't come here to defend myself. I came to understand what's left." "What's left," she said, "is a foundation that can either stand for his legacy or crumble under your silence." She reached into her coat pocket and handed him a second document, a deed signed. He wanted this property to become a place for young engineers, a workshop, a space for kids who build with their hands like he taught us to. Andrew stared at the paper, the ink lines blurring for a moment. "You want me to fund it?" "No," she said. "I want you to mean it." The air hung still. Somewhere outside, a freight train passed, its low rumble filling the space between them. He thought of his son, of the distance he'd created, of the way history repeated itself when pride refused to bend. He met her eyes again. "Then we do it together," he said, under his name. She nodded, once the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time in years. When they stepped outside, the sky had cleared. Sunlight caught the wet asphalt, turning puddles into patches of reflected blue. Elena looked back at the building, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think redemption's really possible?" Andrew closed the door behind them. "Only if we build it," he said. As they walked toward their cars, he felt something shift, a quiet recognition that some debts could never be paid, only transformed. The wind carried the faint scent of cedar and rain, and for the first time in decades, the weight in his chest lightened. He glanced once more at the warehouse in the rearview mirror as he drove away. The place didn't look like guilt anymore. It looked like a beginning. The morning light over Austin was pale and uncertain, the kind that made the city look washed clean but still half asleep. From his penthouse window, Andrew watched the slow drift of clouds over the skyline. Coffee untouched in his hand. He hadn't slept much. The letter from Elena's father and the echo of Ethan's voice in his memory had chased rest away. The warehouse visit had reopened more than old contracts. It had stirred something raw, something that time had merely buried but never killed. He sat at the marble counter, scrolling through old messages on his phone. Years of silence looked back at him. Birthdays missed voicemails. Unreturned, small digital ghosts of things he should have said. His thumb stopped on one old photo of Ethan, maybe 6 years old, covered in mud and smiling, holding up a wooden bridge model they had built together in the garage. The edges of the photo had begun to fade, but the joy in the boy's eyes was still sharp, bright, and painfully alive. He had told himself for years that distance was discipline, that his son would thank him later for building a legacy rather than wasting time on afternoons at the park. But now, staring at that photo, all he could think was how little legacies mattered when no one came home to share them. He took a breath, picked up his phone again, and pressed call. It rang twice. "Dad!" The voice was older, deeper, wary, but not cold. Ethan Andrews said, forcing steadiness into his tone. "It's been a while." "Yeah," came the quiet reply. "A long while. Everything okay? I don't know," Andrew said honestly, "but I think it could be if you'd meet me. There's something I need to tell you." There was silence, broken only by the hum of the city far below. "You sound different," Ethan said finally. "You don't sound like you're calling from an office." Andrew smiled faintly. "I'm not. I'm calling from somewhere quieter inside my head, maybe." A small laugh escaped the line, hesitant but real. "All right, Dad. Tell me when and where." That afternoon they met at Rosie's Diner, the little chrome building tucked beneath a grove of pecan trees off South Congress Avenue. The sign buzzed faintly, letters missing, but the smell of bacon and maple syrup filled the air the same way it had 20 years ago. Andrew parked across the street, sat in his car for a full minute before getting out and crossed the road like a man walking into confession. Ethan was already there, sitting in a booth near the window, tapping his thumb against a coffee cup. He looked up as Andrew entered. There was no anger in his face, only the cautious curiosity of someone not sure if they should hope again. "You look taller," Andrew said as he slid into the opposite seat. "I stopped growing a decade ago," Ethan replied, half smiling. "You just haven't been around to notice." The waitress, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, poured coffee without asking. "Haven't seen you two here in a long time," she said with a knowing grin. "Your kid used to drown his pancakes in syrup." Ethan chuckled. "Still do." When she left, silence settled again. Not sharp, just heavy. Rain began tapping against the window, soft and steady. "I owe you an apology," Andrew said finally, "for more than I can name." Ethan kept his eyes on his cup. "You've said that before, Dad. Usually before another business trip. This time's different." Ethan looked up, then really looked. The suit, the polished voice, the armor of confidence, it was gone. His father's eyes were tired but open in a way they hadn't been in years. "Something happened," Ethan said quietly. Andrew nodded. "I was reminded that success isn't the same as peace. I met someone who helped me remember what it means to make things right. Her name's Elena Sterling. Her father, he believed in me when I didn't deserve it." Ethan tilted his head, listening. Andrew told him about the warehouse, about the hidden box, about the letter written by a dying man who had still believed in redemption. He didn't hide the details, how he had lied, how he had profited, how guilt had followed him like a quiet shadow through every success since. When he finished, the diner was half empty and the rain had slowed. Ethan leaned back, arms crossed. "So that's why you're calling me now. That's part of it," Andrew said. "The other part is realizing I don't want to spend whatever's left of my life pretending that being right is more important than being kind." Ethan smiled faintly. "That sounds like something Mom would have said." Andrew swallowed hard. "She said it often. I just never listened." For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan said softly, "She believed you'd figure it out someday." "I didn't." "That's fair," Andrew said. "But maybe you can start believing again. Not in me, but in the idea that people can change." The waitress brought pie pecan just like old times. "On the house," she said with a wink. "Looks like a reunion worth celebrating." Ethan smirked. "Guess word travels fast here." They ate slowly, the sugar and butter grounding them in something simple, something shared. Outside, the sky began to clear and sunlight pooled across the tabletop. Andrew glanced at his son, then said, "You know, when you were a kid, you built bridges out of scrap wood. You used to tell me they were for people who forgot how to talk." Ethan laughed softly. I was a weird kid. No, Andrew said. You were wise. I just wasn't listening. They walked out of the diner an hour later. The air smelled of wet asphalt and jasmine from a nearby garden. Cars hissed past on the damp street. Andrew hesitated by his car. Ethan, he said, I want to make things right, not just with Elena's family, with ours. Let me try again. Ethan studied him, then extended his hand. Then start by showing up, one dinner at a time. Andrew took his hand. Deal. But as they shook, something deeper than a deal passed between them, a quiet truce that felt like the beginning of forgiveness. When Ethan drove off, Andrew didn't get in his own car right away. He stood under the diner sign, neon humming faintly above him. Across the street, a busker played slow guitar, and a woman laughed somewhere behind him. The world seemed softer, lighter. He started walking home. The streets of Austin glowed gold under the late sun, and the scent of coffee and rain followed him like a memory. He passed a bookstore his wife had loved, paused by the window and smiled at the sight of an old quote painted on the glass. We build because we hope. He whispered it under his breath. We build because we hope. When he reached home, he hung his jacket, loosened his tie, and sat by the window. On the table lay the ledger still bound in its brown cover. But now it looked less like a burden and more like a blueprint. Tomorrow, he would meet Elena again to plan the foundation project. For the first time in years, he wasn't dreading tomorrow. He was waiting for it. Outside, the city's nightlights flickered on one after another like small promises being kept. He closed his eyes, hearing his son's laugh echo faintly from decades ago, and smiled, not the careful, polite smile of a man maintaining image, but the quiet, tired smile of someone who had finally come home. The morning sun stretched wide across East Austin, spilling over cracked sidewalks in the old industrial district where dust and hope had learned to coexist. The warehouse stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, its brick walls stained with time but sturdy waiting. The new sign out front read, Sterling Caldwell Foundation for Engineering Youth, still wrapped in plastic, waiting for its unveiling. Andrew stood before it with his jacket draped over his arm, watching the letters shimmer faintly in the breeze. Elena arrived a few minutes later, her car tires crunching against the gravel. She stepped out in a white linen coat, clipboard in hand, her silver hair catching the light. You're early, she said, locking the door. Old habits, he replied. I didn't want to be late to something that matters. She smiled faintly, her tone soft but teasing. You're learning. Inside, sunlight filtered through tall windows, throwing golden bars across the wooden floor. The once empty space now smelled of sawdust, coffee, and paint. Volunteers moved back and forth, local teachers retired, engineers, even a few neighborhood kids in oversized goggles helping to sort tools. Laughter echoed against the rafters, bouncing between hammers and chatter. It was chaos, but the good kind, the kind that builds rather than destroys. Elena walked the perimeter, pointing things out as she spoke. We'll have classrooms along this wall, 3D printers in the back, and the robotics workshop near the loading dock. It's exactly what my father wanted, a place where kids can learn to build instead of break. Andrew nodded. He'd like this, he said quietly. He'd like that we're here. Elena paused, looking at him. Would he forgive you? He took a long breath. Maybe not, but he'd understand why I'm trying. They spent the next few hours walking the site, checking measurements, approving deliveries, pausing now and then to answer questions from the volunteers. Every once in a while, Andrew caught himself smiling, real smiles, unpracticed and effortless. There was something healing about the sound of young voices filling a place once haunted by silence. Around noon, a teenage girl in overalls approached. Mr. Caldwell. Miss Sterling, she said shyly. We found this behind one of the cabinets. Think it's yours. She handed over a small metal ruler engraved with initials AC and HS. Elena turned it over, a recognition dawning in her eyes. He made this, she whispered. Your first project together. Andrew smiled faintly. We built that model bridge for a charity auction. He said the only thing harder than building it was convincing me to slow down. She looked at him for a long moment, then tucked the ruler into his hand. Maybe now you'll listen. By late afternoon, the air smelled of sawdust and hot coffee. The volunteers gathered for lunch under the open bay doors. Someone brought a speaker playing old country songs, and for the first time in years, Andrew found himself tapping his fingers in rhythm. When Elena caught him smiling, she said quietly, "You know, I never thought we'd get here." "Neither did I," he admitted. "But maybe redemption isn't a destination. Maybe it's just showing up every day and trying again." She nodded. "That sounds like something my father would have said." As the workers packed up for the day, the sunlight deepened into amber. Andrew lingered near the doorway, looking out over the parking lot as the last truck pulled away. "I used to think fixing things was about power," he said softly. "Now I think it's about patience." Elena looked at him, then smiled. "You're finally starting to sound human." He laughed, the sound gentle and unguarded. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me all year." The warehouse lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the dust motes, swirling in the air like tiny ghosts. They stood side by side in the doorway as twilight settled over Austin. For the first time since they'd met again, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was easy. By the following week, the warehouse no longer smelled like abandonment. Paint gleamed fresh on the walls, and the floors carried the faint scent of varnish and sawdust. What had once been a monument to regret was becoming a place of possibility. Each hammer strike, each laugh from the volunteers, layered over the ghosts of the past like healing skin over an old wound. Andrew arrived early every morning, sleeves rolled up, trading the stiffness of his boardroom posture for the rhythm of labor. He had forgotten what honest work felt like, the ache in his hands, the quiet satisfaction of creation. Elena noticed the difference too. Sometimes she would walk past his workbench and smile without saying anything, the kind of smile that meant keep going. They no longer spoke of guilt or forgiveness. It was as if the act of rebuilding the space had become the conversation itself. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the windows, a group of neighborhood kids arrived for a workshop. Andrew watched as a teenage boy tried to fit a gear into a wooden frame, his brow furrowed in frustration. The boy muttered, "It's not working." Andrew knelt beside him and guided his hands. "Try turning it the other way. Sometimes things don't fit because we're forcing them." The boy tried again, and the gear clicked into place. His grin was immediate and bright. "It works," he said. Andrew smiled. "It usually does when you stop fighting it." Elena, standing nearby, caught the exchange and said softly, "Seems like you're good with second chances." He looked up. "I've had practice." Later that week, Ethan visited for the first time. He stood in the doorway, looking around with quiet awe. "This place used to scare me," he said. "Now it looks alive." Andrew walked toward him, dust on his shirt, a wrench still in his hand. "It's still a work in progress," he said. "Like me." Ethan nodded, his voice softer. "Mom would have liked this. I think she would have made it better," Andrew replied. They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that eases years of distance. Elena joined them, extending her hand to Ethan. "You must be the engineer's son." Ethan shook her hand. "Guess I am." "Then you'll understand why this place matters," she said, gesturing around. "Your father's helping us turn a mistake into something that gives back." Ethan's eyes flicked toward Andrew. "He's good at building things. Took him a while to realize people need rebuilding too." Andrew smiled ruefully. "He's not wrong." As days passed, the restoration neared completion. Local reporters began visiting, curious about the unlikely partnership between two once rival names. But Andrew declined every interview. "Let the place speak for itself," he told Elena. She agreed. "The story isn't about who we were," she said. "It's about what we're building now." The grand reopening came on a bright Sunday morning. The warehouse had been transformed into a community hub with wide tables, clean glass, and rows of donated tools. Children ran between exhibits while parents lingered over coffee brewed by local volunteers. Elena stood by the entrance greeting visitors while Andrew hung back near one of the workbenches watching. He didn't crave the spotlight anymore. When it came time for the ribbon cutting, Elena took the microphone. "This space once represented loss," she began, "but today it stands for resilience, for the idea that even the heaviest mistakes can become foundations for something better." She turned to Andrew, nodding gently. "And for the belief that redemption is built, not begged for." The applause that followed was warm and sustained. Andrew stepped forward to cut the ribbon, the sound of scissors crisp and final. A small, clean sound that marked a new beginning. That evening, when the crowds were gone, the three of them, Andrew, Elena, and Ethan, sat on the warehouse steps watching the sky darken into violet. The air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar and rain. You know, Ethan said bridges and buildings aren't that different. Both are just ways to get across. Andrew looked at him, then at Elena. Then maybe this is the first one I've built right. They sat in silence as night descended, the hum of the city soft in the distance. The warehouse lights glowed behind them, spilling golden rectangles across the gravel like promises kept. For once, Andrew didn't think about what he had lost. He thought about what still could be built slowly, carefully, piece by piece. The day of the dedication arrived clear and warm, the kind of autumn morning Austin rarely offered soft light. Gentle wind, the city awake, but unhurried. The newly restored Sterling Caldwell Foundation gleamed like a promise fulfilled. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the courtyard, banners fluttered from the lampposts, and the smell of coffee and fresh pastries drifted through the crowd. Andrew stood near the entrance, his hands folded behind his back, watching people file in. Community members, old employees, former students of Mr. Sterling, who had traveled from different states just to witness this moment. Every face seemed to carry a quiet glow, a shared belief that something rare and right was happening. He caught sight of Ethan helping an elderly woman to her seat, patient and smiling, and for a moment pride swelled inside him, gentle and wordless. Not the kind of pride born from achievement, but from recognition. This is what I built my life for, and I almost missed it. Elena appeared beside him, elegant in a navy dress, a small pin shaped like a gear at her collar. "You nervous?" she asked. "I'd be lying if I said no," he said. "But I think he'd approve of today." "He'd be proud," she said softly. "Of both of us." When the ceremony began, the hum of chatter faded to stillness. A young volunteer stepped up to the microphone and introduced the speakers. Elena spoke first, her voice clear, steady. "My father believed that every invention, every project was really about people. He said machines don't change the world, compassion does." She paused, smiling at the memory. This foundation is dedicated to that belief and to everyone who learns, builds, and dreams here. Then she turned toward Andrew. "There's one more person who should speak." He hesitated, but the applause came anyway, urging him forward. He stepped to the podium, the sunlight warm against his face, and for a heartbeat he wished he could have one more conversation with the man whose forgiveness he'd never hear. He cleared his throat. "For most of my life I thought legacy was measured in what we own, not in who we help. I was wrong. I came here years ago to sign a deal that changed lives for the worse. Today, I'm here to sign a promise to do the opposite." A hush spread across the crowd. "I can't undo what was done," he continued, "but I can make sure that the next generation of builders, kids who look at broken things and see possibility, have what they need to build something better. That's what this place stands for. Not my name, not even his, but the bridge between them." He glanced at Elena. She nodded once, eyes glistening. The audience rose in applause, not thunderous, but full and human, the kind that carries warmth instead of noise. When the applause faded, the crowd slowly dispersed into clusters of quiet conversation. Children ran along the courtyard with paper gliders made from recycled workshop blueprints, their laughter rising above the sound of folding chairs being stacked. The scent of fresh paint and coffee mingled with the soft hum of a nearby guitar. One of the volunteers had brought it, strumming an old folk tune that floated across the late afternoon light. Andrew stepped away from the podium and found himself standing beside the display wall, a simple frame holding the original blueprint of the warehouse next to a black and white photograph of Mr. Henry Sterling. Someone had placed a single sunflower in a glass jar below it. He stared at the picture for a long while, tracing the faint pencil lines on the blueprint, the tiny initials HS plus AC written in the corner. For the first time, he didn't feel the weight of those letters. He felt gratitude. Elena joined him, her hands clasped in front of her. "He'd like what you said," she murmured. "He always believed words mattered more when they were earned." Andrew nodded. "Maybe I finally earned one or two." He glanced toward the far edge of the courtyard where Ethan was talking with a group of students. "He's staying in town for a while," he said. "Says he might help teach the weekend workshops." "That's good," Elena replied. "You'll both need something to build that isn't just walls and windows." They stood quietly, watching the last of the guests drift away. The sky was turning gold, the kind of warm light that made the brick walls look alive. A breeze stirred, carrying the scent of the cedar beams inside the hall. "It's strange," Andrew said after a moment. You spend half your life chasing success, and when you finally stop, all you want is peace. Elena smiled faintly. Peace is just another word for understanding yourself, he looked at her thoughtful. And forgiveness, that's for understanding others. For a while they didn't speak. Somewhere behind them, a child's voice called out, asking if they could come back next week. Elena turned, smiling. Of course you can, she said. This place is yours now. As dusk deepened, the lights flickered on, bathing the courtyard in a soft amber glow. Andrew walked to the edge of the lot and looked back at the building, the warehouse reborn, humming with life. He thought of the man who had once stood in that same spot, warning him not to trade trust for profit. He thought of his wife's steady wisdom, of his son's forgiveness, of all the small mercies that had led him here. Ethan came up beside him, hands in his pockets. Nice speech, he said. You didn't even use your business voice. Andrew chuckled. Maybe I finally retired it. Ethan nodded toward the building. You think it'll last? I hope so, Andrew said. If not the place, then the reason for it. They stood together as the last light slipped behind the city. Inside, someone dimmed the overhead lamps, leaving only the glow from the work tables where a few volunteers still cleaned brushes and packed tools. The rhythm of it, the slow sweep of brooms, the quiet hum of effort, sounded like a heartbeat. Elena approached them, her coat draped over her arm. We're closing up, she said, but I think we did all right. Andrew turned to her. We did better than that. As they left the warehouse, lights reflected off the puddles in the parking lot, turning them into small mirrors of gold. For once, Andrew didn't look back with regret. He looked back with belonging. The three of them walked toward the street, their footsteps even and unhurried. Somewhere a church bell rang the hour, and a warm wind carried the faint scent of rain. For Andrew Caldwell, the sound wasn't an ending. It was the steady rhythm of something rebuilt, something earned. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the limestone hills that framed the city of Austin, setting the horizon ablaze with colors that bled into one another, amber rose and the faintest trace of indigo. The streets, still glistening from a brief rain, shimmered like glass ribbons winding between oak trees, heavy with dew. Andrew Caldwell drove with the windows half open, letting the cool evening wind roll through the cab of his old truck. It wasn't his usual car. He'd bought this one used, beat up, scarred from years of work, but steady. Somehow it felt more honest. He didn't turn on the radio. The hum of the tires against wet pavement was enough, steady and low, like a song he'd once known but forgotten the words to. He passed the old diner where he and Ethan had reconciled weeks earlier. The neon sign flickered, open, the faint smell of bacon and coffee drifting out as the door swung open for the evening crowd. He smiled. It wasn't guilt that gripped him anymore when he saw that place. It was gratitude. Some buildings held their ghosts kindly. The city gave way to quieter streets lined with pecan trees and fading porches, then to the open countryside where cicadas were beginning their nightly chorus. The sky deepened to a soft violet. In the rearview mirror, the last streaks of gold clung to the horizon like stubborn memories. Andrew's hands rested loosely on the wheel, his thoughts slower, steadier than they had been in years. He turned down a narrow gravel road that led to a small chapel by the lake, a whitewood building with peeling paint and a bell tower that had rung over countless weddings, funerals, and baptisms. It was the place where he and his wife Marjorie had been married 40 years ago, and the place where he had said goodbye to her decades later. He hadn't come here since. For years it had been too much silence, too many echoes of promises broken. But tonight, it felt right. He parked under a live oak whose branches spread wide like an open hand. The air smelled of wet soil, wildflowers, and faintly of cedar smoke from a nearby farmhouse. Somewhere across the water, a dog barked, then another answered. He stepped out and closed the truck door gently, unwilling to disturb the evening. His shoes sank slightly into the damp earth as he made his way up the steps, each creak of wood sharp against the hush of twilight. Inside the chapel was small, only 12 pews and a narrow aisle lined with worn hymnals. Candles glowed along the walls, their flames flickering in rhythm with the breeze that slipped through the open windows. The scent of wax and old pine filled the air. He removed his hat and sat near the back, the same spot where he'd sat after Marjorie's service, too proud to cry in public and too broken not to. Now the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a conversation waiting to be had. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes tracing the wooden beams that arched above him. The years seemed to fold in on themselves, long nights at the office, the arguments that ended in slammed doors, the phone calls he never made, the birthdays missed, the words left unsaid. Every failure had once seemed justified by ambition, by the illusion of control. But here, with the scent of rain and candlelight, it all seemed smaller, faded. He took a long breath and spoke softly into the quiet. "You were right," he said, his voice rough but steady. "You told me that building things wasn't about power. It was about love." He smiled faintly. "I didn't get it then. I think I do now." His eyes wandered to the altar where the bell rope hung coiled like a waiting hand. He remembered how after the wedding Marjorie had tugged that same rope until the sound filled the whole valley, laughing like she could make the world hear her joy. He remembered the feel of her fingers against his warm, firm, alive. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out the small steel ruler engraved AC and HS, the one from the workshop, the relic of a friendship and a mistake. The metal caught the candlelight, shining like a sliver of the past made new. He turned it over in his hands. "Henry," he murmured, "I don't know if you'd forgive me, but I hope you'd understand what we built this time." He placed the ruler on the pew beside him as if leaving an offering. The wood creaked softly under the weight. The bell rang once, faint and low. It startled him at first. It hadn't rung in years, but then he saw the sexton in the doorway tipping his hat. "Evening bell," the man said. "For the folks who can't make it to Sunday service." Andrew nodded, his throat tight. "It's a good sound." "Yes, sir," the man said. "Means the day's done and the soul can rest." When the man left, the silence returned, gentler now, full of space. Andrew sat for a long while watching the play of light through the stained glass. The reds and blues shifted across his hands like living water. He thought of Ethan's laughter echoing through the warehouse, of Elena's determined voice as she guided the next generation of the bridge models, and the smell of sawdust and fresh paint. The future wasn't his to control anymore. It was his to trust. He closed his eyes, whispering, "If you can see this, I hope it's enough." Outside, the last edge of sunlight kissed the lake, turning it into a sheet of gold. The bell rang again, softer this time, blending with the rustle of leaves. Somewhere far away, thunder murmured on the horizon, a storm that would never quite reach the chapel, but would remind it of the world's pulse. Andrew rose slowly. His knees ached, but his steps were sure. He walked down the aisle, pausing near the door to look back once more. The candles flickered in uneven rhythm, but together they filled the small space with warmth. That was enough. Not perfect, not permanent, but enough. Outside, the sky had deepened to indigo. Fireflies blinked near the grass, tiny beacons tracing invisible constellations. He inhaled the cool air, heavy with the scent of rain and river. In that moment, the weight that had followed him for half a lifetime seemed to loosen like a knot untied at last. He walked down the gravel path toward his truck, each step sinking into the soft earth. The bell rang one final time, its echo carrying over the hills and across the water. He paused and looked back. For a brief, unguarded second, he saw Marjorie in the doorway of the chapel, just a trick of light perhaps, but real enough to make his breath catch. She smiled. Then she was gone. He smiled back, whispering, "Good night, love." Then he climbed into his truck, turned the key, and let the engine hum beneath his palms. He didn't rush. The road home waited like an old friend, winding between shadow and light. As he drove away, the bell tolled again in the distance, each note fading into the rhythm of the tires against the road, a heartbeat, a benediction, a simple truth. Some bridges take a lifetime to build, but they hold forever once they're made. Night settled over the city like a soft blanket. When Andrew turned off the main road, the narrow lane to his house was glowing faintly under the scattered street lamps. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the scent of it, fresh earth cedar, and the faint sweetness of wild honeysuckle that climbed the fence line. When he pulled into the driveway, light spilled from the kitchen window. Ethan's laughter reached him before he even stepped inside. The sound, bright and real, drew a small smile from him. He paused on the porch for a moment, taking in the warmth that radiated from the house, the muffled hum of conversation, the low crackle of the fireplace. It was the sound of home, something he hadn't truly known in half a lifetime. Inside, Ethan and Elena were seated at the kitchen table. She had brought over a casserole, and the smell filled the small space with comfort. Ethan was talking animatedly about the day's workshop, the kids who'd built their first working prototype of a wind turbine out of scrap metal. "You should have seen their faces, Dad," he said, eyes alight. "They didn't care that it barely turned. They just believed in it." Andrew hung his coat by the door and joined them. "That's what building's about," he said quietly. "Believing in something before it stands." Elena smiled. "You sound like Henry." "I think I finally understand him," Andrew replied, settling into the chair across from them. The three of them ate slowly, conversation flowing easily between laughter and small silences. Outside, the wind brushed gently against the window panes, and the faint echo of the chapel bell could still be heard from across the lake. When the plates were cleared, Ethan poured 3 cups of coffee. He lifted his cup toward his father. "To second chances," he said. Andrew met his gaze and nodded. "To building bridges that last." Elena lifted hers too. "And to the people who don't give up on us even when we deserve it least." They clinked their cups together softly, the sound small but sure. Later, when the house had grown quiet, Andrew stepped out onto the porch. The night sky was a sweep of deep indigo scattered with stars. The air carried the hum of crickets and the low rustle of oak leaves. He leaned against the railing, watching the faint glow of the foundation's tower lights across the lake. He thought of Marjorie's smile, of Henry's steady hand, of all the lives that had crossed his in ways he hadn't deserved but had somehow been given. He spoke softly into the night as if someone were listening. "We did it," he said. "Not perfectly, but we did it." From inside, the grandfather clock struck 9, its chime deep and clear. He looked up just as the chapel bell echoed in response, its tone rolling across the water, blending with the night air. The sound filled the space between the stars, solemn yet gentle like a benediction. Ethan came to stand beside him, hands in his pockets. "You okay, Dad?" Andrew nodded slowly. "Better than I've been in a long time." They stood together in silence. The night was still, save for the steady rhythm of crickets and the soft knock of wind chimes near the door. The world, it seemed, had forgiven him not with words, but with the quiet persistence of ordinary grace. Ethan turned to go back inside. "Don't stay out too long, it's getting cold." "I won't." Andrew said, though he lingered a little longer, his breath visible in the chill air. He thought about everything that had led here, the losses, the rebuilding, the simple, imperfect act of trying again. And he realized that redemption wasn't a moment. It was a rhythm, a daily choosing. When he finally turned to go inside, the bell rang once more across the valley. Softer this time, like a heartbeat fading into stillness. He closed the door behind him, the warmth of home wrapping around him. And in that moment between sound and silence, memory and hope, Andrew Caldwell understood what it meant to be whole again. Sometimes when the day fades and the city quiets, the smallest sounds carry the furthest. In Andrew Caldwell's story, it was the bell that echoed over the lake, a single note that reminded him how far he had come and how forgiveness can ring louder than any regret. His hands, once known for building empires, had learned to build gentler things. Bridges trust a home that welcomed laughter again. Maybe that's what redemption truly looks like. Not fireworks, not grand speeches, just the quiet rhythm of someone choosing every morning to do one good thing better than the day before. Love, after all, is not earned by perfection, but by presence. When Andrew walked back into that kitchen to hear his son's voice and see the light spill across the table, he found what he'd been chasing his whole life, the peace of belonging. And that's the heart of this tale. Love and forgiveness are the real architects of a home. Wealth fades, pride breaks, but kindness endures. In every American town, there's someone rebuilding, patching up a fence, cooking supper for neighbors, teaching a grandchild how to fix an old clock. Those small acts, humble and steady, are what keep the soul of a family alive. Like the porch light that glows long after everyone's gone to bed, a single act of kindness can guide us through the darkest roads of life. It doesn't take much, just the willingness to show up, to listen, to let go. So tonight, dear friends, as you sit by your window or sip your late-night coffee, think about the bridges in your own life, the ones worth rebuilding, the hands worth reaching for. If this story touched your heart, press 1 in the comments. If it left you thinking or you do something differently, press 0 and share your thoughts. Your voice matters here because every story becomes more complete when it meets another heart. And maybe when the evening bell rings again, it will remind you, as it reminded Andrew, that it's never too late to begin again, never too late to come home.